So we've been working our way through the book of Acts. When I was 19, I've told you stories about going to Ecuador. And while I was down there, at one point there were five guys that took 3 large dugout canoes, and we traveled down a river. And we were gone for 3 days. It took us 1 day to go down and 2 days to go back. And it was one of those exotic things where every boat had 2 people to pole it or paddle it, so we just sat there and did nothing. And the natives pulled us down there and then ferried us all the way back, and we pretended like we were hunting, and we did do a little bit of dynamite fishing. I can tell you about that another time. But on the way back, we stopped at the hut of an elderly lady. She lived right alongside the river there. And I don't know how the missionary knew her, but we went into this dark, smoky little hut, and we sat on the dirt floor. And they make a drink called chicha, and they take this root, which is sort of like a yam, and they crush it, and they actually chew it, and they spit it into a bowl, and it's sort of, because if they spit into it, it kind of ferments a little bit. It looks and tastes similar to buttermilk with a little bit of a tiny kick. So we were sitting in this hut, and Lloyd's speaking English, and she doesn't understand a word he's saying. He said, she's going to offer us a bowl of chicha, and you need to drink out of it. And because it's socially important, and we need to be a good witness to her. So I remember sitting there in that dirt and seeing this bowl, and this elderly lady sitting there, and her teeth are all rotted, and but she has sort of a smile on her face. She's really excited we're there. And this bowl's coming down the aisle, and it comes to me, and it's white and got kind of lumps in it and stuff, and I remember drinking that. And that was defining to me, because it said to me that sometimes you have to take risks in loving people. Sometimes you have to do things you're uncomfortable with in loving people. And I've never forgotten that experience. And I didn't die. Affected me mentally, perhaps. But when this church first started, we met in a one-room schoolhouse right across from where Matson Junior High is. And that one-room schoolhouse, Bob has told us about how sometimes the cows would rub up against the building during the service, and the building would kind of, rumble a little bit. And in the top of that building was that large bell, which is now out on our foyer. And so I'm telling you these things because they are stories. And stories are really the defining action or feature of who we are. And our life is a story, and our life is filled with stories. And those stories make up really who we are. And that's true of us as individuals. It's also true of us as a group, as a church. And it's true of the larger church as well. And we have a copy of the Bible, which is God's story, part of God's story to his people. So this morning I want to talk to you about stories and the power of stories, and how every one of you has a story, and how that story influences you, affects you, and how you need to view your story. So last week we talked about how we are all in groups, or we are all in clans, and I used that word. The word clan isn't exactly right, but it's any kind of a group. It could be political, it could be social, it could be related to sports, it could be the fact that you're part of a religious community, it could be related to employment, it could be the people you're related to. All those are different groups. And we talked about how those groups influence, how they define us. And one of the characteristics of groups is that anytime a group has a common enemy, it solidifies that group. And we've seen that in the political realm, especially in the last decade, how they create enemies. And so much discussion is about the enemy, the other party, rather than about really what they're going to accomplish. But the reason they do that is because it solidifies the clan. And when the clan is a common enemy, the clan or group is solidified. We also talked about how Christ went through in his ministry and dissembled all of those, deconstructed all those different clans and the way they were part of them, and it's very fascinating to see that. So as the story unfolds, it's the story of Stephen, and And Stephen is one of the people who have been chosen to be in charge of taking care of the needy people of the congregation of their group. And a lot of great things are happening. And but Stephen has been preaching and talking, and he's seized by a group of people. It's fascinating that the people that seized him are actually sort of part of a clan which is somewhat excluded, and they are people who are not of the Jewish community. They're not people who live in Israel. They're outsiders. They're Jews from other parts of the world. And in my sermon last week, I talked about that a little bit. But here are these outside groups. There's members of the Synagogue of the Freemen, as it was called, Jews of Cyrene and Alexander, as well as provinces of Sicily and Asia, began to argue with Stephen. And they secretly persuaded some men, they said, to conspire against them and to bring criticisms against them. And, there's a lot of lessons in here about story, but one of the first is that sometimes people will try to distort your story. And they will try to tell a different version of the truth about you. And how you respond to this is really, really important, because the first thing that you'll feel is that you'll need to defend yourself. But I think it's very fascinating and revealing that the way that Stephen responded to these people that twisted his story is to tell a different story. And every time you tell a different story, it's very important that you remember that your story always began with God. For every human, the story begins with God. And the story actually begins in the womb. It begins before humans even see you. When you first come out, there are people, probably were people there, well, at least your mother was there, probably others as well, and they were tending to you, and they were helping you to breathe, and they were wrapping you in things, but that wasn't where your story started. The Bible says that your story starts in the womb. So the story always begins with God, and it's important to always remember that God is involved in our story. You're here this morning because at some point you realized God was important in your story. I mean, if you didn't realize that, you wouldn't be here this morning. But you are here because you realize God is an important part of your story. So Stephen begins his defense with God. It doesn't actually begin with Abraham. It begins with God, because he talks about how God took Abraham out of where he was. Another important aspect of this is, I believe that it's never very effective to try and defend yourself. But rather than defend yourself, if you can tell a story, if you can divert the attack from you to a larger picture of what God is doing, of what humans are doing, of what the planet's about, you can many times diffuse the situation. That's important to think about. And in this situation, it's obvious that Stephen doesn't have the desired effect on at least a large portion of these people, because at the end of it, they were still extremely upset. And it says they gnashed their teeth. I don't know what that means, to gnash your teeth, but they gnashed their teeth, and they drug him out of the city, and they stoned him. And so the obvious thing is to think it was a complete failure, that Stephen's speech was a failure. But it was not. We know it's not because of several reasons. First of all, before this ever started, in the end of chapter 6, it says that the number of disciples in Jerusalem increased rapidly, and a large number of priests became obedient to the faith. So Stephen's impact is continuing to grow. And I imagine, it doesn't tell us that, but I well imagine that there were godly people that were standing around watching all this, and they were watching their group stone Stephen, and suddenly there was this disconnect. There had to have been, for many people, to see their response to Stephen as an act of violence and of act of death, and there had to be a disconnect for any people that were truly godly. And they had to walk away from that and say, there's something wrong here. I am a follower of the God of Abraham, and this does not sound like the God that I'm afraid. There's a disconnect here. And what they said also about Stephen is that when they looked at him, he had the face of an angel. Now, how can you say that someone who has the face of an angel is someone that you should destroy? And how can you say about someone who is saying words of truth and about the God that you love, that suddenly he is someone that you want to destroy. So I am convinced that there were people in that group that because of the literal death of Stephen, they turned to God as well. Now, the next thing that happens is it says that he was killed, and the next result is that there's intense persecution, that the church is persecuted heavily, that everywhere they're chasing them and running them down, and Saul himself is beginning to destroy the church, it says in those days. But it also says this. At the beginning of chapter 8, it says, great persecution broke out against the church in Jerusalem, and all except the apostles were scattered throughout Judea and Samaria. And godly men buried Stephen and mourned deeply for him. There are some parts of your story that you need to mourn. There are some parts of your story where other people were involved. Maybe it was in how you were brought up. Maybe it was where you were brought up. Maybe it was the turmoil your family went through. Maybe different instances in your life, people betrayed you, spoke against you. Maybe it's things that you had absolutely no control over, or maybe it is things that you did. I can look back through my life, and there's some things that every time I think about that, I just think, oh man, I wish I would have handled that differently. I just hate that I did that. I hate how I responded to that situation. There's some images, that, even as I say that, come up about things that I did in my immaturity as a Christian that it just caused me to cringe. And I need to mourn those. But you know what happened after that? They buried him. They buried him. They mourned him. They buried him. And then they moved on. And it is so easy for us to take that part of our story and make it who we are. And you need to create a story that doesn't leave those parts out, but that it moves past those parts. Your story needs to not be stuck on those parts. Whatever those wounds are, whatever those pains are, your story needs to move beyond that. And also, the other thing that happens here that's so powerful is it says that the gospel spread. And it's spreading all over Jerusalem, and it's literally spreading all over the world as a result of this. Do you know that nothing anyone has ever done to you, or anything that you will do, will thwart God from accomplishing what he wants to do in your life, if you let him? Nothing. You can't look back and say, my life is completely destroyed because of this part of my story. You need to bury that. That should not be your story. Your story needs to be the goodness that came out of that. And I can assure you that everything in your life that was a negative, if you look carefully, there's a hint of glory in there. There's something good that grew out of that. In our long drive from Anchorage, Rebecca and I spent a lot of time talking. I talked more in those 4 days than I had talked in the previous years, I think. But we talked a lot about growing up. And we talked about some of the difficulties that we had growing up. And it was so interesting hearing our different perspectives on the exact same instance. And we began to discover that even those painful parts of our growing up, there were brightness in there. There was light in there. There were glimpses of hope in there. And we both said, you know what, that's what we need to focus on. We need to stop living on the darkness and live in the light. And that's where we need to write our story. So we have an amazing opportunity. I did an exercise at a retreat one time where we actually drew a line of our life and we wrote out our story and the different high points of it. And that may be a good exercise. I don't know. I don't still have it. I don't even remember what I did. But I think what is a really good exercise is as we move from this place, as we move ahead, to be determined and to know in our hearts that our story is not done yet. If our story was done, God would take us to the next place. But our story will not be done, because our story is beginning now and continues for eternity. And so as we look forward with hope. We look forward with anticipation. We look forward for brightness, for light, for God to continue to use us in amazing ways, and for God to continue to use this church in amazing ways. And even whenever we die, that's not the end of our story. There will be a point there when people will mourn us. But you know what? They're going to look at our life and they're going to remember the great things of our story. And we need to remember that. We need to remember those great things in our own life and in other people's lives and reflecting back to them. And stop dwelling on the bumps and start dwelling on the hope that you have in Christ, the hope of eternity, the hope of God, the hope of life ahead. Stand together and let me give you a benediction. May the God of hope, may the God of the great story help you to see your story in a way that you've never seen before. And may you go forth and live it. Amen.